fraternity prank. Also, the Pope decided today to release Vatican-related bath products. An incredible thing. Yes, it's the new Pope on a rope. It's right, Pope on a rope. Wash with it, go straight to heaven. Thank
Hello,
you.
everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach. This is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And I just want to start out by saying Happy New Year. It is 2024. We have all made it. You have arrived. You have survived 2023. And let's look forward to the new year. And what I want to do today is I want to look at this issue of what are some of the best books you can read to get better at Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Now, what's interesting is that I get a variety of people that ask me a lot of different questions related to this channel. And as you know, we deal with a lot of different things from philosophy, theology, politics, and culture, and so much more. But it's interesting because whenever I discuss these matters, I get a whole different audience base and a variety of my friends that are asking questions about martial arts or people looking on the internet. And this is a question that people ask me all the time because they know that I've trained in various different martial arts and they know that I train in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. So they're wanting to know, who's the best person to follow? Should I buy this book? Should I train here? Should I train there? And one thing that I try to do is that I always try to make a video out of the top questions I get so that I can send a comprehensive answer to somebody, so that I'm not just giving them some off the cuff kind of thing, so that they can actually learn and meaningfully apply each one of them. So with that, I've got a special announcement. So as I've been saying, I've been doing martial arts for a number of years. In fact, I remember that I started my first martial art on June 29th, 1999. I had to memorize that in order to test for my black belt back in the day. But even prior to that, I started out wrestling. But here is the special announcement. Just a few weeks ago, I was given my coveted and long sought after brown belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And I was so excited about it. You know, when you get to like the fourth stripe on your belt, you start wondering, you know, am I going to get it? Am I not going to get it? At some point in time, will I get this? And I am so excited that I was able to get this earned gift given to me. Now, it's not just a gift. It's not something that's just given to you willy-nilly. In Jiu Jitsu, you have to earn it. And I've been doing Jiu Jitsu now for a number of years. I've been doing striking martial arts for a number of years, but I was very excited about it. And that actually leads me to the question of like, how did I get to this point? And that's really what I want to do and focus on today is I want to spend time dialoguing with you on some of the best books that you need to read in order to get better at Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. So the question you need to be asking is how do I get better at Jiu Jitsu? Not just which books should I be reading? And I know that this is a comprehensive answer. And I remember that my Jiu Jitsu professor, he's like, well, you get better by just getting on the mats and training. And included in that is learning techniques, going through the grind. As we say on ours, you got to embrace the suck. You got to be terrible. You got to embrace not being able to do anything as you grow. And then you're going to be able to find that there's this transition that takes place. It's really just the strengthening of you as an individual doing jiu-jitsu. But the reality is the battle that you're going to face is, I don't know enough techniques and I can't apply enough techniques. So what you need to be able to do in order to get better at jiu-jitsu is you have to have some body of knowledge. You got to have some tools in your tool belt in order to actually do jiu-jitsu in a meaningful way. But you need to go beyond just mere theoretical knowledge to the application of them. So I give you this initial quote as we get into this. And it's a quote from Carlson Gracie, the infamous jiu-jitsu instructor from Brazil. And remember, you've got Carlos Gracie and Helio Gracie, and Carlos's oldest son was Carlson Gracie. And he says this, you know 1,000 techniques and suck at all of them. Which isn't that so much the truth of everybody that does jiu-jitsu. You know, you get on the internet, you read these different books, you do these different things, and you accumulate all these different techniques, but you can't perform any of them. And that's what the real balance is going from theoretical knowledge to practical knowledge, because a person can have a million tools in their tool belt. Say they're going to go build a house or something, but if you don't know how any of them work and you can't apply them, well, they're functionally useless. But I know the theory of them is not enough. So what I want to do is I want to briefly lay out just a few questions and then get into some of these key books and things, because I want to provide a little bit more of a comprehensive answer than what I typically find on the internet. So the question that we first must ask in order to bridge this gap between technique and ability to perform them is like, what is Brazilian Jiu Jitsu? You know, and that's a long answer, and I don't want to answer it in full. But a lot of people think of as, you know, they just look at it, well, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu is the gentle art, and it was developed and evolved within Brazil, right? That's all that it is. And, there is some truth to it. It is the gentle art, but we must ask ourselves the question, what do you mean by gentle? Because if you talk to anybody who's done jiu-jitsu, you're like, oh, my neck is killing me. My back is sore. My muscles are sore. You realize that very quickly, there's not much actually gentle about jiu-jitsu. Now, I'm not saying people always get hurt. I don't want to portray that kind of, mindset upon you as you think about jiu-jitsu, but we realize like, it's not a walk in the park. Like it's a struggle. It's something you have to work on. And what we have to see is that we have to actually ask ourselves, what do we mean by the term gentle? So we have to reject the idea that it's somehow this soft art or it's a passive art. But as one of the books that we're going to look at says, we need to see that the concept of jiu-jitsu and the concept of gentle as it relates to its art is that it's using techniques to combat brute strength or just, vain aggression. We all understand what that is. You see the meathead at the gym. He's all lifting weights. He's constantly taking pictures of himself. And you see the skinny little guy over there. And you wonder, how could that little guy beat that guy? And the answer is jiu-jitsu. Namely, it's the idea that we use techniques to beat this combative brute strength that's coming to us. And that could be just overt aggression or strength. Another way of putting it is this: it's the use of weaker force to overcome a stronger force. It's the use of techniques to beat brute strength. And for so many people, this is what drew them to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. I remember growing up in the state of Iowa, and for grappling arts, the art that I first started learning that I actually didn't even think was an art, I thought it was a sport. I thought it was just something you did when it was really cold outside and you couldn't do anything outside because we have harsh winters in Iowa, and that was wrestling. And, I was probably ignorant at the time, but to realize like that's one of the most effective martial arts that a person could ever learn. But I remember the first time I heard, I was like, jiu-jitsu, what are you talking about? And then somebody put on the old UFC videos, and you see these big grappling guys and they're going to come out one strike, one kill, and knock these individuals out. But what happened consistently? The little small Brazilian guy, Gracie, came in and he used technique or weaker force to overcome brute strength or stronger force. And it wasn't something that was just a fluke, like, well, you got lucky with that one. No, it was consistently happening with him and then other people who were doing Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And then you start to study the history of this and you realize there's something more here. Like we've kind of been duped from martial arts movies that has taken away something about the practicalities of different martial arts. And when I saw that, I knew everything kind of changed because I'd always done striking martial arts. I'd done wrestling, and wrestling is really good at closing the distance and, getting the clinch and getting it to the ground. But then you ask yourself, what am I going to do from there? And what started to bring all of these together was jiu-jitsu. So with that, we have to ask ourselves another question as it relates to it. So many people in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu obviously want to get better. In fact, if you're watching this video, you probably clicked on it thinking, hey, I want to read those books that this guy's talking about so that I can get better at jiu-jitsu and do the things that we see in the UFC or in the classic, challenge matches and all the rest. And you're going to ask and look at it and say, well, the obvious answer to that question is that we just need to learn more techniques, right? If I can put more tools in my tool belt and I can learn the counter to the counter of the counter against my friend or against this opponent or against this person on the street, I'm going to be able to get better at jiu-jitsu. And the reality is like there's some truth to that. Yes, you clearly need to have like a series of techniques. They're going to help you in order to apply them in a real situation. Like you're not going to be able to do something that you don't know about or that you're unaware of or that you haven't trained or you haven't practiced and seen and worked week in and week out to apply. But if it's just the mere collection of random assorted techniques, you're never going to actually be able to apply them. And that's why we go back to that original quote from Gracie. You know 1,000 techniques and you suck at all of them. And, there's like the old adage that when we would look at traditional martial arts, Bruce Lee used to say something like, I'm not afraid of the man who knows 10,000 kicks. Rather, I'm more afraid of the man who's done one kick 10,000 times. And that's what I think we need to see here is that if you want to get better at jiu-jitsu or you want to get better at martial arts, it's not just, I know more techniques. Because when you look at the traditional martial arts, you're going to see things within classic jiu-jitsu, like Japanese jiu-jitsu or karate or kung fu or aikido. And there are hundreds, if not thousands of techniques. But when you watch them try to do it in real street situations, a lot of times they're not doing them. And when you look at the UFC, the ultimate, well, if there were no rules and we could just really go at it, because there's a lot of this, like I will say, there's a lot of people in traditional martial arts that say, well, I lost the tournament because I can't do it the way I train, which really they mean like the deadly street techniques. And I get what they're saying with that. I think a lot of that's just vain rhetoric, if you want my honest opinion. And if you're actually a good martial artist, you can work within the rules of the easier, less deadly techniques. But one of the things I don't want you to see is that if UFC proved anything, if it showed anything, it's that many of these martial arts that have endless katas and endless techniques, they weren't actually that effective. And when you watch videos, people are really doing a very small, select amount of techniques that they use repetitively that actually work on a day-to-day basis. And even the so-called deadly techniques don't always work in real life. And in fact, what's interesting is that the martial arts that train the real street, the real deadly techniques, they actually don't train them in real life training because one, they're going to get injured. And two, they're mainly focused on katas and not an actual application. So the point of all of that is, and the reason I'm saying this, we're leading up to books, is that it's obviously not just the accumulation of techniques that matter. Rather, it must be the consistent application of techniques under real circumstances that actually matters. And people wonder why that's such a big deal. And the reason it's such a big deal is because so many martial artists act as though, if I learn the next kata, grasshopper, I will somehow arrive at a new level. Or if I somehow memorize every technique in the book, I will become the next, jiu-jitsu champion or street fighter champion. When the reality is that it's not the number of techniques that you just know. You can teach anybody hundreds of techniques in a passive situation, and they can't apply any of them in a real life situation. So why this video? Why now? Why related to this? Here's the real question. How do we get better at performing real techniques under real circumstances? So going back to the original thing about what is jiu-jitsu, it's using technique to overcome brute strength. And in their book, Mastering Jiu-Jitsu, John Danaher actually gives that definition. He looks at that idea of that's what jiu-jitsu is actually trying to do. But one of the other things that they look at is that when you look at classic Japanese jiu-jitsu, there wasn't a whole lot of real application in the sense of sparring. There were a lot of deadly techniques. There were a lot of effective techniques, but they didn't spar in the exact same way. And, a lot of the history shows, with the changing of political regimes, jiu-jitsu started to be seen as sort of just this, punk street fighter kind of thing. And that's watering it down in many respects. I want you to actually read the books to get the full history of them. And that martial art in many ways was like just falling by the wayside. And Jigoro Kano, he changed the name and he changed the image of it. And he called it judo. So it's not just this art, it's this way of life. It's this way of developing yourself, but it's also a specific way of training. And in fact, when you look at judo, and you look at probably the most influential thing that Jigoro Kano gave us, it was a new way of training these traditional martial arts. And what he tried to do is he tried to incorporate realistic, repetitive, actual sparring. It's not just theory. It's not just light touch. It's not stopping short. He required them to remove some of the more dangerous techniques, realizing, there are some techniques that if we did them over and over again, people are going to get severely injured to the point of being crippled and maybe never, ever being able to train again. And he also created a way that you can throw people and submit people where, you have like the agreement that I'm going to stop when I tap you. and you're going to let go of that deadly technique. And a lot of people think that started to water down, the sport effect of judo, watered down this real effective martial art within jiu-jitsu, the classic jiu-jitsu understanding. But what it actually did is it strengthened those techniques because people were able to regularly practice them without getting severely injured. And on the flip side of it is that it actually didn't water down anything, because even the traditional martial arts weren't practicing these so-called deadly techniques. So through the various katas, they merely practiced on either no partner, or they practiced on a dramatically passive partner. So Jigoro Kano was able to develop a method of training that prevented injuries and maximized training. And this is what was so influential with jiu-jitsu, is that jiu-jitsu was able to take that method of training and apply it not only to stand-up takedowns, but to a fully orbed grappling martial art. And that's what I want to do as I bring us to our first books here. And I know that was a lot of setup, but again, this is a full, complete answer that I want to give you. So the first book that I want to recommend that you read is titled Mastering Jiu-Jitsu by Renzo, Gracie, and John Danaher. And what you're going to find in this book is that it's going to provide a wonderful history of all the things that we've been talking about. It's going to talk about what is jiu-jitsu. Notice this. It's spelled a little different. And he goes into why it's spelled different. This is the classic spelling, not maybe a misspelling that people have given. It's this traditional idea of jiu-jitsu as it was transformed into judo, as it was transformed into Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and all the rest. And one of the things that he's going to look at is that transformation into real sparring, I think, was probably one of the most essential evolutionary concepts that was brought to the whole world of martial arts. And the reason is that it filled the gap between, I know all of these techniques, but yet I can't do all of them in a real life situation. And that was one of the things that he talks about in the history of this book. Is it's this transition from classical Japanese jiu-jitsu into judo. And then it also looks at this issue that was really interesting, is that even Jigoro Kano at the Kodokan, they were running into this issue. Yes, they were winning all of these techniques and all these different tournaments, but then they ran into a group of people from the Fusen-ryu Jiu-Jitsu, and I'm going to probably butcher this name. It's Matemon Tanabe. Forgive me. I'm not really fluent in Japanese at all. And what they did is they actually focused on more grappling techniques than they did just more of the stand-up techniques. And the reason I bring this up is that Jigoro Kano actually had many different sort of combative tournaments between these different schools out there, proving which one is the best one. And this Fusen-ryu form of jiu-jitsu focused more on grappling techniques. And in fact, they trained those grappling techniques in that hard application method of what judo did with the different takedown techniques. And you know what they did? They beat them. They beat Jigoro Kano's school with the Kodokan, so much so that Kano went out and actually recruited them to teach this grappling emphasis to people at the Kodokan. And what they were trying to do was bring this whole systematic approach together. And it was during that time that you got figures like Maeda, who was training there. He's one of the best guys to train under the Kodokan, where he was learning the special emphasis of not only the takedowns and that aspect, but the real grappling influence of jiu-jitsu into judo. And as we all know, Maeda went to America, he went to Brazil, and it was there that Maeda met with the Gracies. And you see the transformation where you see them applying not just the judo, the classic judo, but this Fusen-ryu and judo combination, and they called it jiu-jitsu. And I know that's a brief overview, but what was so realistic about it is that Maeda did real fights where he had to go up against Western boxers and people that fought a little differently. And he had to learn, how do I deal with this in real practice with people throwing strikes at me and, close the gap, get the clinch, deal with real grappling situations. And that's the world in which the Gracies were developing Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And the reason that's important is that you start to see the real street effectiveness of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and the combative effectiveness of Jiu Jitsu. Another thing that you see is that he talks about in this book, one of the reasons you need to get this book is not just the history, but he talks about there's an emphasis upon positional strategies and training methods, realistic training methods, practical training methods that actually work in real situations, but also this idea that, we talk about this, position before submission, but what we have to see is that there really wasn't as much of an emphasis upon that in traditional understandings of the grappling arts. Is that, if you hold a guy down in a pin, yeah, you're controlling him, but what are you going to do after that? Or what if I go for a submission and I lose the submission because I don't have a strong enough position? And one of the things that Danaher does is he talks about what jiu-jitsu did is it gave us this very strategic understanding of dominant to less dominant positions and neutral positions and how to overcome them. So for example, obviously being in the mount is better than having somebody on top of you and they have the mount on you. Well, it's one thing to know that, like for now we look at that and we go, that's intuitive. Well, that was almost a revolutionary idea to say, no, we're going to fight for positional controls and this whole idea of positional strategies on how to go from one technique to another technique. For example, having somebody in back mount or having back control on somebody is more dominant than having somebody in your closed guard, because closed guard is more of a neutral position and having the back on somebody is a more dominant position. So with a specific emphasis upon these positional strategies and different training methods, you see the evolutionary concept that took place within Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Now, another thing that you're going to find here is that there was this strong emphasis in this book. And one of the things that I really like about Danaher's book is that he looks at, how does combat actually work? Do we need to look at this issue? He's going to talk about, traditional errors of ranges of combat. Is it just, are you out of range? Are you in close range? Can you only use certain strikes in different ranges? And he's going to talk about that and why there are weaknesses with it. But he doesn't just talk about why they're weak. He replaces it with, I don't think just a simplistic understanding, but a realistic understanding of how do the phases of combat work. And he gives us what are known as free movement, clinch, and grappling. And we understand free movement. This is where a lot of the strikes happen. People are squaring off. They're trying to figure out what's going on in the situation. But it's funny because even in that free movement, you always see the clinch. Two boxers, they're going at it and then they end up in a clinch. Or you see two grapplers, they're at distance and then they get into a clinch and they take it to the ground. Now, many strikers try to hit that clinch and back away from it because they like that freestyle movement. Whereas many grapplers like the clinch because they want to go into the grappling. So his three stages that he talks about are free movement, clinch, and grappling. And the whole book is laying out just this history and philosophy of jiu-jitsu. And then he spends significant time talking about what are those three phases, what should you do in those three phases, and how do you combine those three phases. And the reason that's so important is that they go on to explain how these work effectively within real combat, both in MMA and on the streets. And why that's important and why I start out with this book and I start out with that is that there are many people that do jiu-jitsu today that don't even understand the concept of different phases of an attack. And they don't understand what we could say is like the big picture of how fights actually operate. If you go out and get in a street fight, it's not like you're just going to always pull guard and do something like that. You got to understand, what does the free movement stage look like when strikes are reality? What does grappling look like when you have a strong clinch against a striker versus against, say, a high-end wrestler? And one of the things that you're going to find is in this book is that many of the techniques are geared towards a method of fighting, not just the accumulation of more and more techniques. And I think that's what makes it so valuable and why you should read it in your practice of jiu-jitsu is that in jiu-jitsu, unlike other maybe games or events, you're presented with a new circumstance virtually every time that you roll. And you need to have a method and concepts that you can apply over and over again with the techniques, because you're not going to have the exact same situation given to you. And you got to be able to think on the spot in order to readily apply it at that time. So let me give you an example. There are a lot of people that will play chess. And a lot of people, when they learn chess, to do it right, you actually got to learn it in reverse. So you teach somebody how to get check on, just say, the king and one other piece on the board. And then you start adding more and more pieces and developing the situations. And the point is that in those early situations, you can make them very repeatable. But as you add more and more pieces onto the board, even some of the best AI technology Where it struggles is how do we actually start this? And that's where all of the game starts to end, is how do I start to engage this whole motion? So the way you learn it is you learn the basic repeated techniques, but you have to have that conceptual awareness that's going to take place. And that's why when you see here, you learn random techniques within Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. But the really good figures are the people that understand the driving concepts that unify all of those different techniques within the entire martial art. And that's what this book is going to give you. If you want to know what this is going to do, it's not going to give you the most techniques. It's not going to give you, all the intricate details of the Danaher Death Squad and all of those figures. It's not going to give you, the intricacies of how they do the heel hook. It's going to give you the key techniques, but it's also going to give you the whole philosophy of jiu-jitsu, where it came from, why it's unique, how you put the big pieces together. And in that, it's probably one of the most valuable books you're ever going to read. Because if you can't put that together, you're not doing traditional jiu-jitsu in any sense of the term. So again, the techniques are geared more towards a method of fighting, not just the accumulation of more techniques. It's focused on what you could consistently apply, not just a collection of theory separated from real martial arts practice. That's why it's so valuable. It's good for MMA. It's good for sportive aspects. It's good for real street fights, because it provides a good understanding of how to apply jiu-jitsu in all of these different situations. And Danaher clearly explains sort of the different levels of conflict and how to deal with each one of them in a realistic situation. So again, why should we read this book? It gives you a great history. It gives you the philosophy of jiu-jitsu. It gives you the different phases of combat, how they're going to take place. You're going to learn how to do it in combative situations with MMA. You're going to get different street scenarios. In fact, Danaher brings so much to the table here, because he looks at what are just even different street scenarios and how you would apply it and when you would not apply it. He worked as a bouncer for years. He's clearly seen more than just, scheduled, fights that take place within, with a ref in the MMA arena. And that's so valuable in and of itself right there on how do you actually engage these different types of situations. Now, I will also say this. I like this book a lot because, I have a PhD in philosophy. Danaher has a background in philosophy. In fact, I think he went to Columbia. From what I've heard in other videos, he did everything but complete the dissertation, because I'll tell you what, academia can sometimes be terrible, and it's a endless ladder climbing, and jiu-jitsu can sometimes provide you a better life and career, and Danaher realized that. But one of the reasons that's so important is that he leaves no stone unturned. He's clear. He defines his terms. He lays out exactly what he means by things. So if you want something that's like that, this is the book for you. So why should you read this book? You got to know your roots. You got to understand why jiu-jitsu training is unique in the history of martial arts. You got to grasp the overall sort of picture of how a BJJ fighter actually approaches a fight, namely the overall method and why it's so effective. And then you need to understand how to apply it in just normal competition, MMA, and on the street. So first book, I know this is going on, but this is one of the first books you need to get. I'm going to put a link for it down in the description of this video here. Please click on it. Again, Mastering Jiu-Jitsu by Renzo, Gracie, and John Danaher. Now, the next book that we're going to look at, and we're going to go a little faster with some of these, is The Master Text by Grandmaster Helio Gracie. And, the reason that I picked this book is because there is that divide that's going on right now within jiu-jitsu. What is self-defense jiu-jitsu? What is not self-defense jiu-jitsu? And I agree with the idea that all jiu-jitsu is self-defense jiu-jitsu, but there also has to be a reality that sport jiu-jitsu sometimes puts you in positions where it's like you're easily going to get punched in the face. You're easily going to have these situations where you're not dealing with real combative situations, worm guard, inverted this, that, and the other. And we can't distance ourselves from that street martial aspect that was just so essential to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I think that's what this book is going to do for you, is that it's going to explain the self-defense aspects of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I think the reason that that's important is because we can never distance ourselves from that heritage. And in fact, if you're going to combine the first two books, if sport jiu-jitsu is messing up at anything, it's messing up at not giving us the complete philosophy of what made historic jiu-jitsu, the freestyle aspect of it, where strikes are coming in. Most jiu-jitsu doesn't even deal with that at all. It's completely irrelevant. It is not there and it's not taught. Or what's the difference between a grappling clinch versus a clinch that's going to occur in the midst of striking, or these random situations? And that's why you need to have both this hard training aspect, but the realistic self-defense aspect of how fights can actually go on and how they actually take place. Now, with that, I want to give just one little quote from this book to explain why this book is unique. Let me flip to it here real quick. And Helio actually talks about this. So, all right, bear with me on what makes his jiu-jitsu unique. And he says this: it is not necessary to confuse this martial art with sport competition jiu-jitsu, as is being done for strong, heavy, and trained athletes. The world-famous Gracie jiu-jitsu was perfected by Helio to give greater protection to the less physically capable, the executives, ladies, and children on a course of 36 private lessons, so they will not be physically humiliated by bad and cowardly troglodytes. Competition has nothing to do with personal efficiency, so be careful not to mix things up. So the point of this book, I mean, he makes it very clear, is he wants you to learn the self-defense aspects of jiu-jitsu, because clearly he sees a difference. And I know that this is a debatable thing, and I do think that there's a lot of overlap between the two, but the second you add strikes in the street into it, it's just a different beast, and you got to be ready for them. So why is this book unique? Well, it's unique because it gives you that classic street self-defense of jiu-jitsu. And in fact, you know, many of the traditional classical Gracie jiu-jitsu practitioners, they actually have to know and demonstrate this book in order to go through the different ranks. In fact, I know a lot of guys, you know, they get different stripes on their belts from hard rolling, but they demonstrate the techniques at the upper ranks by going through the master text. And I watched a video one time with Pedro Sauer, and he was talking about, he had this conversation with Helio, and he was, you know, I'm going to America. I'm going to be teaching jiu-jitsu. I'm going to be doing these different things. What do you want me to keep in mind? Like, what do I need to do? And he just said, promise me that you're going to always continue teaching the self-defense aspects of jiu-jitsu. And that's what Pedro uses as people go through different ranks. I know a guy in particular who he's had to demonstrate those for each stripe through his brown belt, and then again for the black belt. And if you look at it, you know, people think, oh, why would you need to go through that each time? Well, it's because you got to do these moves over and over again under realistic situations in order to be effective in real life. And I think it just gives an objective criterion, because again, jiu-jitsu is a never-ending journey, but sometimes we need to have consistent sort of guidelines on and criterion on what it means to be a jiu-jitsu blue belt or purple belt or brown belt, black belt, and so on and so forth. So let me give you a few things here. What are some of the strengths of this book? First of all, it provides a wonderful array of techniques that regularly occur in real street altercations. Again, things that you see untrained people doing, things that are happening in real life. You know, you watch the YouTube video, you watch the Instagram video. Oh, this guy got attacked on the street. What are they doing? They're attacking like this, because 99.9% of the world are untrained fighters that don't know what they're doing, and they do chaotic things that are really just more, you know, untrained, ignorant, naive aggression. And they think things like headlocks and hair grabs and shirt grabs are the most effective things. And what we need to realize is that if we're going to have what is known as like the taxonomy of how we're going to do it, I would rather train for something that happens 99 out of 100 times versus something that happens like 1 out of 1,000 times. Like, how many times on the streets do you need to know how to get out of inverted worm, blah, 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 blah? Very rarely. Am I saying sport and technical jiu-jitsu doesn't need to train that? No, train it, learn it all. But look at the realistic idea of the triangle that we have. Fill up your base with these techniques, because when the real situation hits, you're going to fall down upon your base. You know, as the old saying goes, you know, how do you make a black belt into a brown belt? Punch him in the face. How do you make him purple belt? Punch him twice. How do you make him blue? Punch him 3 times. Because we're going to fall back to that which we know, that which is essential, that which comes out of us. And that's what this book is going to do. It's going to give us some of the most realistic situations. Now, another thing that it's going to do is it's going to give you a realistic approach to dealing with them. And I think that's one of the things that we look at, is that there are so many martial arts that recognize, yes, these are realistic situations. These are real situations that people face, but they give like terrible responses to them. And it's sometimes in the method that they train, but also sometimes it's just the techniques that they do, where you look at it, it's like the guy grabs you here, you're going to grab his hand, kick him in the knee, flip his arm over, bend the wrist. Give me a break. Like, it's not going to work. And there's a lot of people that train martial arts with passive drilling, and, you know, the guy gives just a little stronger grip and it doesn't work. And like, oh, but in the real situation, it's going to, no, it's not. You can't expect somebody to do a passive drill and some kind of kata. Say let's just change this and like apply it in this sense. What if we did passive drills and katas with, like, you know, football? Even take something like high school football, you know, not even real high level football. It's all going to change when you get on the field and you get hit the first time, or they pull you around the first time. Why would it be any different with martial arts? And that's one of the reasons that I just look so poorly upon martial arts like Aikido or passive drilling arts, in that sense, that don't actually apply them in a real sense. And that's what I think this book does, is it not only gives us real issues, but it gives us realistic responses to real situations that are actually going to occur. So that's one of the strengths of this book. Now, another thing that I want you to know, just to give you the big picture of it, what he's going to do is he's going to give you different techniques from standing from the front, standing from behind, weapons defenses, things when you're on the mount, guard, side mount, and the back. So it's a very comprehensive book of basic elementary things to do from there. But don't think basic is, you know, simplistic. These are realistic situations, like the most common situations you're going to find. So, for example, I'll just read a few of these off here because you may get the book because of it. So he's going to look at things like two-hand front choke, or, you know, somebody pins you up against a wall, or single hand collar grab, or headlocks with punches or without punches, or headlocks when somebody's bent over, or guillotine chokes, or front kicks and elbow strikes and punches. And how do you deal with all of those? Or from behind, you know, somebody picks you up with a bear hug from behind, or somebody attacks you with a knife. Things to do with somebody has you on the mount. How do you get out of the mount? How do you handle somebody if you got them in your mount, or the guard, and so forth? So in that sense, it is very comprehensive in that. And I think having these two books sort of coupled together, you're going to have enough realistic street self-defense techniques and the big theory of jiu-jitsu that you're going to have a really good understanding of what's going on. Now, it also shows you, and here's another interesting thing, is that a lot of people think, oh, jiu-jitsu, you sit on the ground and you just do these ground techniques. Well, I hate to break it to you, classic, historic, real jiu-jitsu has strikes, it has punches, it has kicks, has headbutts, it has means of dealing with those freestyle situations. It has an ability to close the distance on a person, clinches, takedowns, all the rest. There's everything that goes on with it. And remember, the reason for that is that it incorporated the training method of judo. It dealt with all of the grappling situations with that Fushin-Ryu grappling elements that came into it. Maeda and others were doing challenge matches all over. And that's the world that classic, historic Brazilian Gracie Jiu Jitsu was birthed into. And that's what they were working on all of the time. So what I want to do is I want to make one quick little transition here, because people are like, okay, I get it. What's going on here? And I want you to see, what might this look like? Because, you know, one person might say, you know, one of the big weaknesses of this book is, isn't it just showing you a bunch of random techniques and not giving you a way to practice them in a realistic sense? And if you were just reading the book as, you know, just reading it like you're reading the dictionary, yeah, it would be just that. But you need to learn that as you bring the philosophy of jiu-jitsu together, which most people don't know, and they need to know by learning from like Danaher and Renzo's book, you bring that philosophy together with a real school that does effective training, you can bring these things together. You know, you can't just memorize a random assortment of techniques. They all have to come together in a full sense. So with that, let's look at one video here from the Valente brothers, who show what these techniques might look like. And they're going to give grab self-defense techniques in a real street situation here. Let me make sure everything's all queued up. And here you go. So again, I would highly recommend, like, subscribe to their jiu-jitsu or their YouTube channel, follow what they do with jiu-jitsu, because I think that there's no group that does it better than the Valencia brothers and maybe Gracie University and a lot of their assorted schools that bring it together. But what did you see there? Like, those are realistic techniques. And, I do like the old classic definition, like, what is a blue belt? Somebody that can handle themselves against a bigger, stronger, untrained person in real life situations on the streets. And you're going to see that's exactly what they're doing there. So I think it's a great thing that you need to go through. You're going to see how it incorporates it, brings it together. And this book is going to provide that for you. In fact, my background, one of the things, like, I have a strong striking background in karate and some of those. And there are certain techniques that I've seen with those. I'm like, oh man, there's great things within it. But then there's aspects of it where you're like, this 280 thing just isn't going to work. And what I've tried to do is bring a lot of this into that conversation, replace it with it. So I train jiu-jitsu, and sometimes I use that book to fill in some of those random street techniques. Now, I want to make another plug with this. Wasn't asked to do this. I'm just doing this because I think it's important. In order to bring the philosophy together, yeah, you can read some of these books, but you can also learn it another way. One of my favorite things is actually Gracie Combatives. Now, this is my old DVD set on it. Now it's 100% virtual. You can get it online. In fact, they have a new edition of it that's out that somebody showed me. It's really nice. Like, they updated it, and they'll do things like, for example, if they want you to focus on this hand technique, like the hand will get yellow for a second, and you're going to see where, because it's going to focus your attention there. And what this does, I think it's really a unique approach because it has 36 different lessons. I think it ends up being something like 75, 76, 77 techniques. And they're looking at some of the most dominant things that happen. Like, if you're going to look at a street fight situation or a lot of the fights that they had with Gracie challenge matches, what actually happened in them? Like, what are the techniques people are using against them? What techniques were they using to actually win fights the most often? And you're going to find that these are the ones that they're looking at. Things like trap and roll, Americana arm lock, positional controls, clinching. Like, you get a whole philosophy of jiu-jitsu clinching right here. I mean, clinch against a passive person, an aggressive person. What if they're throwing a haymaker? How do you do a double leg? What are you going to do with, different headlock situations and all the rest? It's wonderful in this sense. And I think if you actually did these two together, you would have a very strong foundation for jiu-jitsu. Not only that, this is going to teach you how to, as I say, speak jiu-jitsu, understand the concept of jiu-jitsu, because there are a lot of people who just don't even understand when they walk through the doors, what's a mount, what's a guard, what's this? People have no clue. They're going to give you a lot of that and give you a method of understanding what is jiu-jitsu, how can I learn new techniques of jiu-jitsu, how can I filter my jiu-jitsu. But ultimately, the things that these two books are going to, or the DVDs and this book are going to do, is it's going to give you that foundation of self-defense. And, you'll receive video instruction. And if you're like me, I like to read things, but video helps me a lot, because sometimes if I can see it and I can hear people explain it in different ways, you're going to learn the broad philosophy of self-defense, but you're going to learn a broad variety of different techniques. And, they're not going to cover every technique that's in this book because, not every technique that happens in this book meets their criterion of like what happened the most in their street fight or their challenge match techniques. Like, they actually had a method by which they delineated that. But if you learn this, you're going to have the conceptual framework to apply all of these new moves that happen in different situations. So if you have the right training method and the right philosophy of bringing them together, you're going to have a great foundation with it. Another thing that people say is like, there's a lot of people that dog on this, and, they're not just learning jiu-jitsu on the internet. They're training at all these different CTCs with instructors that have gone through lots of training in order to open the school and run the school. They have a whole host of students, and it's real jiu-jitsu learned in a real way. It's just different than what sport jiu-jitsu is. So it's made against the untrained individual in real life situations, not against, these phenom sort of, figures that come out and enter these tournaments and they're like blue belt killers. It's going to give you realistic self-defense jiu-jitsu. So I think combining those two together will give you a great foundation. You know what? After you have that great foundation, it's not saying this is where you stop. This is where you start, and then you can do all of the other things. But I think it's just a sad day if a person is a high-ranking jiu-jitsu practitioner and they don't even know how to do punch block series from the guard. Like, seriously? Have you separated yourselves from your fighting roots of martial arts so much? And that's why I think you got to have these things come back together. So again, combative strives to be, bring together the most popular attack situations on the street. Not all the moves in the master text are there, but it's going to give you a great game plan. And I highly recommend putting these all together. So the final one, last but not least, switching, little different kind of book here, is Jiu Jitsu University by Saulo Ribeiro and Kevin Howell. And what this book does is, I would say it like this. Renzo and Danaher's book is going to give you the overall theory and history of jiu-jitsu and how the phases of attack are going to work. It's going to give you the whole conceptual framework, and it's going to give you a great framework from that. In fact, I think that's why I would actually recommend Renzo and Danaher's book before any of the rest. Like, that's the go-to book that you need to understand the big picture. Helio's book is going to give you more of those issues on the phases of attack, on random street self-defense, and how they're going to work in basic clinches into the ground. You've got to know those. And then you could add in combatives with it. But Saulo Ribeiro's book is going to give you the most exhaustive list of BJJ techniques that can be used for both street and competition. Now, some of them you would use definitely for street competition, or for competition more than street. But in the end, these guys can bring them all together in many respects. Like, some techniques you may not want to use, but he's going to bring a lot of them. So here's why I like this book. The typical person who's going to get Jiu Jitsu University by Saulo Ribeiro is most likely a person who has been training regularly. They're at some Jiu Jitsu academy. They have a real instructor in front of them. They've had to deal with the situations that are uncomfortable. They can't get out of them, and they're trying to evolve their Jiu Jitsu game. Or it's the person who's still trying to do all of that, but they just simply can't remember, like, man, what's that kind of technique we did 2 years ago on this day? And so in this sense, it's a great reference tool. And you're going to see the greatest accumulation of techniques that I found that are clearly illustrated with good pictures, good explanations, point by point instruction on them, so that you can just develop your jiu-jitsu game. Because, there is an element of, you need to be able to do them, but there are certain situations where you're like, oh, if I just would have done that, I could have got out. And this book's going to bring that together. So the way that I look at it is that this book presupposes the philosophy of jiu-jitsu, presupposes the self-defense aspects of jiu-jitsu, but it's also going to bring all of these techniques together so you can evolve your jiu-jitsu game. So it assumes pressure testing. It assumes you have a professor that's going to do this. You're not just reading this book, so some random person that's just like reading the dictionary for fun. This book is good for individual study. I think it could also be good if you're just trying to find a methodological way to increase your jiu-jitsu game. So here's why you need to get this book. It's all of those things and more. I like his graded approach to it. He discusses different moves of jiu-jitsu, but he shows the different phases that you should actually learn these different moves. And he breaks them down into sort of white, blue, purple, brown, and black belt exercises. Now, some people are going to immediately object. They go, well, you need to know them all. You need to learn them. Yes, you do. Like, the ideal jiu-jitsu practitioner needs to, but when the average person walking into your jiu-jitsu academy, like, they don't know what an arm bar is, more or less how to connect them to other moves. And the graded approach to it gives it in a logical, systematic approach. Now, that doesn't mean if you're, a jiu-jitsu black belt, that you have to all of a sudden go through it in that graded approach. Like, you can flip back and forth, but the reason you can flip back and forth is because you have the intellectual capability and the practical capability to do that. So the beauty of this is that he shows how to go from nothing to an advanced practitioner. And we need that. We need to see how they layer on top of one another. No, like I've said, like, this is the idealistic method. You can go and learn, his black belt techniques at white belt or white belt at black belt. It's a constant cycle of learning these techniques. So let's look at this. Like I said, the harsh truth is that he realizes is that at different games, different levels of your jiu-jitsu game, you're going to face different things. And when you first start out jiu-jitsu, you will be the nail for a long time, and everybody's going to be the hammer, and people will sometimes utterly smash you, and you're going to have to learn how to defend yourself. And I know, like, that's a different philosophy of how jiu-jitsu should be done. Some schools don't start out training like that early on, but the reality is that whenever you start that, even if you know a lot of techniques, you're still going to be put in those situations because, again, knowing techniques doesn't mean you can actually do the techniques. So what he does, and what I really like about this book, is the way that he grades it is he starts from what you're going to most likely experience to where you're growing towards. And one of the things that you're going to look at is that you need to learn at your very early stages things like defenses. So his white belt phase in here are all the different defenses that you need to learn. Now, is it saying that's all you need to learn in order to go from white to blue belt? Oh no. Like I think he would not just give a belt out for, oh, you know, these 10 defenses, here's your blue belt. Because we all recognize, like, if you're a white belt and somebody who's your same size or smaller, or even just a little bigger than you, that's an untrained individual, comes and holds you down and you can't get out of it, you don't deserve your blue belt. Like, a blue belt needs to be able to have good defense, good escapes, and then dealing with those kinds of controls. They need to deal with defense and escapes early on. And, you know, he's looking at what that means. And I know that there's a lot of debate, like, what is a blue belt? What is a purple belt? And people could look at all of that. But the way he breaks it down is, we're finishing off here. You start out with defenses, that's white belt. Blue belt is a focus on escapes. Purple belt, you're going to develop your guard. Brown belt, you're going to look at guard passes. And at black belt, you're going to look at submission. So the reason, again, why does a white belt start out with learning all these defenses and escapes? Well, that's most likely where you're going to end up. And as you learn to defend and escape, you're going to become a blue belt. And yeah, you're going to get submissions on other white belts here and there. But just because you get your blue belt doesn't mean that you're going to be able to get out from higher ranking belts. So you need to have more emphasis on escapes. And that's what he looks at. And then let's just say you're a purple belt, which means you've gone all the way through your white and your blue belt. Well, where are you most likely going to end up? In your guard. And that's why he focuses on guard. Notice, you're going from being the nail, being the bottom. You're able to escape. You go to your guard. What's after guard? You're most likely going to get out. You're going to get better positions. You're going to learn how to pass the guard and deal with somebody's back. And that's what he's looking at with brown belt. And you're going to obviously learn all of the other things, but then finally you get to your black belt position here, which is going to be a focus on submissions. And I think one of the things that he looks at is that if you're able to get out and you're able to get a dominant position, but you can't hold that position, you're not going to get the submission. So one of the reasons that this is so influential, why it's such a good book, is that he recognizes this ordering, this gradation of different techniques. So with no further ado, the reason you need to get it is it's going to give you a comprehensive set of techniques and a graded approach. You can mix them all up however you want to train, but this is the logical outworking for how jiu-jitsu should go. So quick summary again. You need to get the Mastering Jiu-Jitsu text by Renzo Gracie and John Danaher. Start here. Read it first. The next thing you need to do is get the Master text by Helio Gracie. And I will say this, the Master text is a little pricey. Just know that. I would also tell you to get Gracie Combatives. Go along with it. And then finally, Jiu-Jitsu University by Saulo Ribeiro. So let's finish with this. Remember this quote that we gave from Carlson Gracie, you know 1,000 techniques and you suck at all of them. That's the reality of so many practitioners out there. In order to combat this, we got to take the significant insights from Jigoro Kano and bring techniques into realistic training. That's the heart of judo. The grappling aspects of it with the takedowns is the heart of jiu-jitsu. We can't lose it. It's not about the number of moves that you know, but the number of moves that you can apply in a realistic, actual pressure-tested situation. Jiu-jitsu is not just sport competition, it's a comprehensive method of fighting. All of these things are included with it. We must learn all the aspects of freestyle movement, of clinch, of ground grappling, untrained attacks that people are going to give us on the streets, weapons, strikes, top, bottom, back, submissions, all of it. That's jiu-jitsu. So again, links to these are provided below. Please like and subscribe this channel if you found this helpful. Please share it if you get the chance. And again, thank you. Os.
10,000 years will give you such a crick in the neck.